Commander Ethan Cole counted the marks on his cell wall for the 11th time that morning, and each scratch reminded him that he was still alive, still breathing, still trapped aboard an alien vessel that floated somewhere in the cold darkness between stars. The cell was not uncomfortable, which surprised him more than anything else about his situation as a prisoner of the Valkorian Empire. The walls glowed with a soft blue light that never flickered or changed, and the air tasted clean and fresh, almost like mountain air back on Earth. A sleeping platform rose from the floor, perfectly shaped to fit his human body, and food appeared 3 times each day through a small opening in the wall. But Ethan was not fooled by the comfort, because he understood that he was nothing more than an animal in a cage. A specimen to be studied and observed by creatures who looked at humanity the way humans might look at insects. The Valkorians stood nearly 8 feet tall, with silver skin that seemed to shimmer like mercury under any light. Their eyes were large and violet, without pupils, and they moved with a grace that made Ethan feel clumsy and primitive. They wore flowing robes of colors he could not name, colors that seemed to shift and change as they walked. In 11 days of captivity, Ethan had noticed something strange about his captors, something that puzzled him more with each passing hour. They never touched him, not once, not even when they needed to move him from one place to another. Instead, they used invisible forces, gravity fields that lifted him and carried him without any physical contact. At first, Ethan thought this was some kind of disgust, as if humans were too dirty or too primitive to touch. But then he began watching the Valkorians more carefully, and he realized something even more surprising. They never touched each other either. He watched guards pass in the corridor outside his cell, and they always kept distance between themselves, never allowing their bodies to come close. He saw scientists studying him through transparent walls, and they handed objects to each other using small floating platforms rather than their own hands. Even when 2 Valkorians spoke in close conversation, they stood at least 3 feet apart, as if an invisible barrier existed between them. What kind of society was this, Ethan wondered, where beings lived and worked together but never allowed their skin to meet? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching his cell, lighter than the heavy stride of the guards who usually patrolled the corridor. Ethan stood and moved toward the transparent wall that served as the front of his cage, curious about this new visitor. She was young. He could tell that immediately, though he had no real way to measure Valkorian age. Her silver skin was smoother than the adults he had seen, and her violet eyes held something the others lacked, a brightness that looked almost like curiosity. She wore simpler robes than the scientists and officials, deep purple with silver threads woven through the fabric. The young Valkorian stopped before his cell and simply stared at him, her head tilted slightly to one side like a bird examining something interesting. Ethan waited, unsure of what to do or say. "You are the human called Ethan Cole," she finally spoke, and her voice surprised him because it was softer than the cold, formal tones of the other Valkorians. "I am Seravan, daughter of High Diplomat Kalthos," Ethan nodded slowly, wondering why the daughter of such an important official would come to look at a prisoner. "Why are you here?" he asked, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I wish to see you with my own eyes," Seravan replied, and she took a small step closer to the transparent barrier. "I have read all the reports about your species, but reports are cold things that do not capture truth. And what truth are you looking for?" Seravan was quiet for a long moment, and Ethan could see her struggling with something, some question that seemed to cause her difficulty. "In the observation recordings," she finally said, "you were seen doing something strange when your capture vessel was first brought aboard our ship. You placed your hand upon the shoulder of another human prisoner before they were separated. Why did you do this?" Ethan blinked, confused by the question, because it seemed so simple and obvious to him. "He was scared," Ethan explained. "I was trying to comfort him by touching him?" "Yes," Siravan's violet eyes grew wider, and she leaned forward with intense interest. "And this works?" she asked. "Placing your skin upon another being's skin makes them feel less afraid?" "Of course it works," Ethan said, still puzzled by her fascination. "Humans are social creatures. Touch is how we show care, how we build trust, how we tell someone they are not alone. A hand on the shoulder, a pat on the back, a hug from someone who loves you. These things matter to us." The young Valkorian seemed almost dizzy from his words, as if he had just described something beyond her understanding. "I have read about this," she whispered. "Your people have something called a handshake, where strangers grasp each other's hands when they first meet. Is this true?" "Very true. And an embrace, where two beings wrap their arms around each other's bodies. Your kind is this also." "We call it a hug," Ethan said with a small smile. "Parents hug their children. Friends hug when they meet after a long time apart. People hug when they are happy or sad or just because they want to feel close to someone." Siravan stepped back from the barrier, and Ethan could see that her silver hands were trembling slightly. "Does skin contact not overwhelm you?" she asked, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "Does it not flood your mind with thoughts and feelings you cannot control?" "No," Ethan replied, now beginning to understand that something deeper was happening here. "For humans, touch is simple. It feels nice. It makes us feel connected. But it does not overwhelm us." The young Valkyrian stared at him as if he had just told her that humans could fly or breathe underwater. "You walk through your lives constantly touching," she said slowly. "You shake hands with strangers you have never met. You embrace friends in public places. You hold your children close to your bodies. Every day," Ethan confirmed. Siravan placed her silver hand against the transparent barrier. Her fingers spread wide, and she looked at Ethan with an expression he could not quite read. "I will return," she said quietly. "I have many more questions." Then she turned and walked away, her purple robe swirling behind her, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and a growing understanding that something very different separated his people from these strange silver beings. He did not know yet how important that difference would become, but as he watched Siravan disappear down the corridor, he felt something he had not felt in 11 days of captivity. He felt hope. Siravan kept her promise and returned to Ethan's cell the very next evening, slipping through the corridors when most of the ship's crew had retired to their quarters. She came again the night after that, and the night after that, until her visits became the one thing Ethan looked forward to in his endless days of captivity. Each time she came, she brought questions. Dozens of questions about human customs and human behavior, about the small daily acts of touch that humans performed without thinking. "Tell me about the handshake once more," she would ask, her violet eyes shining with fascination. "When two strangers meet for the first time, they truly grasp hands." "It is how we say hello," Ethan would explain, never growing tired of her interest. "It shows trust and respect. When I offer you my hand, I am saying that I come in peace, that I mean you no harm. And children?" Siravan asked during another visit. "Your reports mention that human parents carry their young in their arms. They hold babies against their chests for hours at a time?" "Babies need that contact," Ethan told her. "They need to feel warm and safe and loved. A baby who is never held will grow up feeling alone in the world." Siravan shook her head slowly, as if she could not quite believe what she was hearing. "I have a daughter," Ethan said softly, and speaking of her made his heart ache with longing. "Her name is May, and she is 7 years old. When she was born, I held her in my arms for the first time, and I thought my heart would burst from the love I felt." "You held her," Siravan repeated. "I still hold her. When she has bad dreams, she comes to my room and climbs into my bed, and I put my arm around her until she falls asleep again. When thunderstorms come and she feels scared, I sit with her and hold her hand. Just that simple thing, holding her small hand in mine, makes her feel brave enough to face anything. The young Valkorian was silent for a long time, and Ethan could see emotions moving across her silver face like clouds across a sky. "We do not do this," she finally whispered. "We cannot do this. Why not?" Siravan moved closer to the transparent barrier, and when she spoke again, her voice was heavy with sadness. "My people are telepaths," she explained. "We are born with minds that can reach across space and touch other minds. This gift has made us powerful, has allowed us to build a great civilization across 1,000 worlds. But it comes with a cost that your people could never understand." Ethan listened carefully, sensing that he was finally about to learn the truth about these strange silver beings. "When a Valkorian touches another Valkorian," Siravan continued, "skin to skin, the telepathic bond opens completely. There are no walls, no barriers, no protection. Every thought, every memory, every fear and shame and secret desire flows between the two minds like water through an open gate." "Everything?" Ethan asked, his eyes widening. "Everything. If I were to touch your hand right now, I would see every moment of your life, feel every emotion you have ever felt, know every thought you have ever thought. And you would see the same in me. Nothing could be hidden. Nothing could be protected." Ethan began to understand, and the understanding filled him with a strange sadness. "So touch between your people is not casual," he said slowly. "It is the most intimate act possible." "It is more than intimate," Siravan replied. "It is absolute surrender. Among my people, skin contact is performed only between bonded mates, and only after years of courtship rituals that prepare both minds for the joining. To touch a stranger would be unthinkable. To touch someone against their will would be the greatest violation, worse than any crime you can imagine." "But what about children?" Ethan asked. "Surely parents must touch their young ones sometimes." Siravan's violet eyes filled with something that looked like grief. "Valkorian children are raised in communal nurseries," she said quietly. "They are cared for by machines and by caretakers who use tools and gravity fields. A parent might spend years with their child without ever touching them, without ever holding them the way you describe holding your daughter. That sounds so lonely. It is all we know. We learn from the earliest age that touch is dangerous, that it must be controlled and feared. We build walls in our minds to protect ourselves from accidental contact. We keep distance between ourselves and everyone around us, even those we love." The young Valkorian pressed her silver palm against the barrier once more, and Ethan could see tears forming in her strange alien eyes. "And then I read the reports about your species," she said. "I learned that humans walk through crowded streets where bodies press against bodies. You sit in vehicles packed with strangers. You dance together, play sports together, shake hands and hug and kiss without any fear at all. Because for us, touch does not work that way," Ethan said gently. "Our minds are private. When I hold someone's hand, I feel their skin against mine, but I do not see their thoughts or feel their emotions. The connection is physical, but our minds remain our own. You have no idea what a gift it is," Siravan whispered fiercely. "You live in a state of constant physical connection that my people can only dream about. You touch freely, love freely, hold each other without fear of being consumed." She stepped back from the barrier and wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture that looked so human it made Ethan's heart ache. "Among my people," she continued, "there is a saying, the skin is a prison. We are trapped inside our bodies, forever separated from each other by the very gift that allows us to touch minds. We can speak thoughts across vast distances, but we cannot hold hands with someone standing right beside us. And humans are the opposite," Ethan realized. "We cannot read minds, but we can touch freely. Our skin is not a prison. It is a bridge." Siravan looked at him with an expression of profound wonder. Your species lives in a state of perpetual vulnerability, she said slowly. You expose yourselves constantly to touch from others. You give trust without guarantee, offer closeness without protection. And you call this normal. You call this love. Ethan nodded, understanding now why his simple act of placing a hand on a frightened prisoner's shoulder had seemed so remarkable to these aliens. We do not think of it as vulnerability, he said. We think of it as being human. Connection is what makes life worth living. A life without touch, without hugs, without holding hands with someone you love. That is not a life I would want to live. Siravan was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. I wonder sometimes what it would feel like, she admitted. To hold someone's hand without fear. To embrace someone simply because you wanted to feel close to them. I have wondered this my entire life, but I never told anyone because such thoughts are considered shameful among my people. She looked at Ethan with eyes full of longing and fear and hope, all mixed together. I must go now, she said, but I will return. I have so many more questions. And as she walked away, Ethan realized that this young Valkorian was searching for something her entire civilization had lost. Something that humans possessed without even knowing its value. She was searching for the simple, beautiful, terrifying freedom of reaching out and touching another soul. 3 weeks after his capture, Ethan was awakened by the sound of heavy footsteps outside his cell, and he knew immediately that something was different about this day. The guards who came for him were dressed in ceremonial armor that gleamed like polished silver, and their faces were cold and hard as stone. They lifted him with gravity fields and carried him through corridors he had never seen before, past vast windows that showed the endless stars spinning slowly outside the ship. Other Valkorians stopped and stared as he floated past, their violet eyes filled with curiosity and something that looked like fear. Ethan tried to stay calm, tried to keep his breathing steady, but his heart was pounding in his chest like a drum. They brought him to a massive chamber that took his breath away with its size and grandeur. The ceiling rose so high above that it disappeared into darkness, and the walls were covered with strange symbols that glowed with soft golden light. Hundreds of Valkorians sat in tiered rows around a central platform, all of them dressed in fine robes and wearing expressions of grave importance. This was no simple meeting, Ethan realized. This was a trial. The guards placed him on the central platform and released the gravity field, allowing him to stand on his own feet. Ethan straightened his back and lifted his chin, determined to face whatever was coming with dignity. A tall Valkorian rose from the highest tier, his robes more elaborate than any Ethan had seen, threaded with gold and silver and gems that caught the light. His face was ancient and stern, and when he spoke, his voice echoed through the chamber like thunder. I am High Admiral Velthax, commander of the 7th Fleet and voice of the Valkorian Council. You stand before us today as a representative of your species, human, and the Council will now pronounce judgment upon your kind. Ethan said nothing, knowing that any words he spoke would make no difference to beings who had already decided his fate. Our scholars have studied your species for many cycles, the High Admiral continued. We have observed your behavior, analyzed your biology, examined your history, and we have reached a conclusion that cannot be ignored. He paused, and the silence in the chamber was absolute. Humanity is dangerous, the High Admiral declared. Not because of your weapons or your technology, which are primitive compared to our own. You are dangerous because of your nature, because of the savage tactile bonding that forms the foundation of your society. Ethan felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain silent. Your species touches constantly, the High Admiral continued, his voice filled with disgust. You press your bodies against each other without thought or restraint. You allow strangers to grasp your hands. You embrace in public places. You pass children from arm to arm like objects. The Valkorians in the audience murmured in agreement, and Ethan could see the horror on their faces as they imagined such behavior. This constant contact creates bonds of loyalty and trust that cannot be broken, the High Admiral said. It allows your kind to form tight social groups that act as one, that fight as one, that would die for each other without hesitation. Such unity is a threat to any species that encounters you. He raised his hand and pointed directly at Ethan. Therefore, the Council has voted to quarantine your homeworld permanently. No human vessel will be permitted to leave your solar system. No alien vessel will be permitted to enter. Your species will be contained until you either evolve beyond your primitive nature or destroy yourselves, which our scientists believe is the more likely outcome. The chamber erupted in sounds of approval, and Ethan felt despair washing over him like a cold wave. His people would be trapped on Earth forever, cut off from the stars, imprisoned by these beings who feared the simple human act of reaching out to touch another soul. But then, through the noise of the crowd, he heard something else, a commotion near one of the lower tiers. Valkorians were turning to look, their voices rising in shock and alarm. Ethan saw her then, pushing through the crowd with desperate determination. Siravan. Her father, the High Diplomat, reached for her but stopped short of actually touching her, and she slipped past him and descended toward the central platform where Ethan stood. Guards moved to intercept her, but she was the daughter of nobility, and they hesitated to use force. Siravan, her father shouted. What are you doing? Stop this madness at once. But she did not stop. She walked across the platform until she stood directly before Ethan, her violet eyes meeting his brown ones with fierce intensity. The chamber fell silent, every Valkorian frozen in shock at what they were witnessing. I wish to understand, Siravan announced, her voice strong and clear. I have read the reports about humanity, but reports are cold things that do not capture truth. I wish to know the truth. She extended her hand toward Ethan, her silver fingers trembling visibly. No, her father cried out, his voice breaking with horror. The guards raised their weapons, pointing them directly at Ethan. The High Admiral's ancient face twisted with fury and fear. Siravan, daughter of Kelthos, the High Admiral commanded, withdraw your hand immediately. You do not know what you are doing. I know exactly what I am doing, she replied, and her voice did not waver. I am reaching out. I am touching another soul. I am doing what my people have been too afraid to do for 10,000 years. She looked at Ethan, and he saw tears streaming down her silver cheeks. Please, she whispered, so quietly that only he could hear. Show them. Show them what touch can be. Ethan understood what she was asking, and he understood what it would cost her. If he took her hand, she would experience the full telepathic bond. Every memory and thought and feeling he had ever had would flood into her mind. She would see everything he was, everything he had been. And she was willing to bear that. She was willing to surrender completely to prove that humans were not monsters. That touch was not something to be feared. He looked at her trembling hand, silver and slender and shaking with fear and hope. The guards tightened their grips on their weapons. Her father screamed for her to stop. The High Admiral shouted orders that echoed through the chamber. Ethan Cole, prisoner of the Valkorian Empire, representative of all humanity, reached out his hand. And he took hers. The moment their skin made contact, a shock wave of energy rippled through the chamber, visible as a pulse of light that made everyone gasp. Siravan's eyes went wide, wider than Ethan had ever seen them, and her body went rigid. The guards did not fire. They stood frozen, their weapons raised but unused, waiting to see what would happen next. And what happened next changed everything. The moment Saravan's silver fingers touched Ethan's human skin, Her mind opened like a flower opening to the sun, and everything she had ever been taught about touch shattered into a million pieces. She had expected chaos. She had expected a flood of alien thoughts that would overwhelm her mind and drown her consciousness. She had prepared herself for pain, for confusion, for the loss of everything she was. Instead, she felt warmth. Pure, simple, beautiful warmth that spread through her mind like sunlight spreading across a cold room. And then the memories came, not as a violent storm, but as a gentle river, carrying her through Ethan's life with tender care. She saw him as a child, small and brown-haired, running across green grass toward a woman who knelt with open arms. His mother caught him and lifted him high, and Siravan felt the joy that exploded in his young heart, the absolute safety of being held by someone who loved him beyond measure. She saw him as a teenager, awkward and uncertain, standing at a school dance with sweating palms. A girl with red hair took his hand and led him onto the floor, and he felt nervous and excited and alive. When the song ended, she hugged him briefly, just a quick embrace between friends, and that simple touch gave him courage he had never known he possessed. She saw him on his wedding day, standing before an altar with a beautiful woman named Sarah. When the ceremony ended, he kissed her and held her close, and Siravan felt love so deep and pure that it made her telepathic senses ache with wonder. This was not the controlled, careful bonding of Valkorian mates. This was wild and free and glorious. She saw him in a hospital room, holding a tiny creature wrapped in pink blankets. His daughter Maya, just hours old, with wrinkled skin and closed eyes, and the smallest fingers Siravan had ever seen. Ethan held her against his chest, and the love he felt was like nothing in Valkorian experience, unconditional and infinite, and given without any expectation of return. And then she saw the everyday moments, thousands upon thousands of casual touches that meant everything and nothing at the same time. A handshake with a colleague on the first day of a new job. A pat on the back from a friend after a difficult conversation. His wife's hand reaching for his across a restaurant table. His daughter climbing into his lap to listen to a bedtime story. These humans touched constantly, freely, joyfully, and each touch strengthened the bonds between them. They built their lives on physical connection, on the simple act of reaching out and holding on. And there was no fear in any of it, no calculation, no careful protection of private thoughts. They gave trust without guarantee. They offered themselves to others without knowing if that trust would be honored. They loved in the open, where anyone could see, where anyone could hurt them. And Siravan understood at last why her people feared this species. Humans were not dangerous because they were savage or primitive. They were dangerous because they were brave. They were brave in ways that the mighty Valkorian Empire could never match. The telepathic bond between Siravan and Ethan rippled outward through the chamber, and every Valkorian present felt echoes of what she was experiencing. They could not receive the full flood of memories as she could, but they sensed the emotions, the warmth, the overwhelming peace of human connection. And they were stunned. Slowly, one by one, the guards lowered their weapons. Their silver faces showed confusion and wonder and something that looked almost like longing. Siravan turned to face the council, her hands still clasped in Ethan's, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "They are not primitives," she declared, her voice ringing through the silent chamber. "They are not savages to be feared and contained." She held up their joined hands for all to see. "They are what we were too afraid to become. They give trust without guarantee. They touch without armor. They love without contracts." The High Admiral's ancient face had gone pale, and Siravan could see that he too had felt the echoes of human love through the telepathic field. "Their touch does not overwhelm or destroy," Siravan continued. "It heals. It comforts. It tells another soul that they are not alone in the universe." She looked at her father, who stood frozen in the crowd with an expression of shock and something that might have been hope. I felt his memories, Father. I saw his life. And do you know what I found? I found a man who loves his daughter the way you have never been allowed to love me. I found a species that has conquered the fear we have carried for 10,000 years. She squeezed Ethan's hand tighter, and he squeezed back, offering support in a simple human way. They are braver than we ever dared to be, Siravan finished. And if we quarantine their world, if we trap them behind barriers of fear, we will not be protecting ourselves. We will be proving that the mighty Velkarian Empire is afraid of something as simple as a handshake. Silence hung over the chamber like a heavy cloud. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single voice spoke. She speaks truth. Siravan turned to see who had spoken and found an elderly Velkorian rising from his seat, his robes marking him as a scholar of high rank. I have studied human culture for many cycles, the scholar said. I believed them dangerous because their bonds were so strong. But now I understand. Their bonds are strong because they risk everything to form them. They give trust before they know if it will be returned. That is not savagery. That is courage beyond anything we possess. Other voices began to murmur in agreement, and Siravan felt hope blooming in her heart. The High Admiral raised his hand for silence, and when he spoke, his voice was not as certain as before. What you have shown us today challenges everything we believe, he said slowly. The Council will need time to reconsider its decision. Then take time, Siravan replied. Study humans as allies instead of threats. Learn from them instead of fearing them. And perhaps one day, we will find the courage to do what they do every moment of their lives. She looked at Ethan, and he smiled at her, a warm human smile that made her heart feel light. Perhaps one day, she whispered, we will learn to hold hands. The High Admiral nodded slowly, and Siravan saw something change in his ancient eyes, something that had not been there before. It was doubt. Doubt about everything his people had believed for 10,000 years. And doubt, she knew, was the first step toward change. The vote to quarantine Earth failed by a margin that surprised everyone, even those who had voted against it. In the days that followed, the Velkarian Council issued new directives that changed the course of history between two species who had once been strangers. Humanity was not to be feared. Humanity was to be studied, learned from, and eventually befriended. Siravan stood at the center of this revolution, her silver hand still remembering the warmth of human touch. The Council appointed her as the first Velkorian ambassador to Earth, a position that had never existed before, and that many believed was impossible. You will have to shake hands. Her father warned her before she departed. You will have to accept embraces and endure physical contact with beings who think nothing of touching strangers. I know, Siravan replied, and for the first time in her life, she smiled at her father. Without fear. That is exactly why I must go. Before she left, something happened that had never occurred in the history of their family. High Diplomat Kalthus reached out his trembling silver hand and placed it gently upon his daughter's shoulder. The telepathic bond opened between them, just for a moment. And Siravan felt something she had never felt from her father before. She felt pride. She felt love. She felt hope for a future neither of them had dared to imagine. Then he pulled his hand away, and they stood in silence, both of them changed forever by that brief moment of contact. Go well, my daughter, Kalthos whispered, and teach our people how to be brave. Ethan Cole returned to Earth as a hero, though he never thought of himself that way. The transport ship that carried him home landed in a field outside his city, and hundreds of people gathered to witness his arrival. But Ethan did not see the crowds or hear the cheering. He saw only one thing. A small figure running toward him with arms outstretched. Maya! He dropped to his knees and caught his daughter in his arms, holding her so tight that she squeaked in protest. "Daddy," she laughed, "you're squishing me." "I know," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I know. Sweetheart, I just missed you so much." His wife Sarah was right behind Maya, and soon all three of them were tangled together in an embrace that made no sense to any watching Valkorian, but made perfect sense to every human present. This was what touch meant. This was what the silver-skinned aliens had been afraid of for 10,000 years. Not power, not danger, just love. Simple and pure and freely given. In the cycles that followed, Siravan's work as ambassador changed the relationship between Valkorian and human forever. She attended diplomatic functions where she was required to shake hands with dozens of strangers. And each time she felt echoes of their thoughts and emotions, but she did not drown. She learned to ride the waves instead of fighting them. She visited schools and hospitals and homes, watching how humans interacted with casual physical affection. She saw parents hug their children goodbye before school. She saw friends pat each other on the back after sports games. She saw elderly couples walking hand in hand through parks, their fingers intertwined after decades of marriage. And she shared her observations with her people through detailed reports that were read by millions across the Valkorian Empire. Young Valkorians were the first to experiment. They started with brief touches. A brush of fingertips, a momentary grasp of hands. The telepathic bond would flare, overwhelming at first, but they learned to control it, to filter the flood of information into something manageable. Parents began touching their children, just moments at first, then longer as both sides grew more comfortable. The bond was still intense, still powerful, but it was no longer something to be feared. It became something to be treasured. Ethan and Siravan stayed in contact over the years, sending messages across the void between their worlds. She told him about the changes happening in Valkorian society, about the young ones who were learning to hold hands, about the families that were finally embracing their children. He told her about Maya, how she was growing up, how she had started asking questions about the silver-skinned aliens who had once been enemies and were now becoming friends. One day, Siravan received an invitation that made her silver heart race with emotion. Ethan's daughter was getting married, and he wanted Siravan to attend. She traveled to Earth for the ceremony, walking among hundreds of humans who pressed close together in celebration. The bride wore white, and the groom looked nervous, and when they exchanged rings, the crowd erupted in cheers and tears. Then came the moment Siravan had been waiting for. The newly married couple walked down the aisle, and everyone they passed reached out to touch them, to pat their shoulders, to squeeze their hands, to offer blessings through physical contact. Maya stopped before Siravan and smiled. "Thank you for coming," the young woman said. "My father told me about you. He said you were the bravest person he ever met." Siravan shook her head. "Your father is the brave one. He showed my people what courage looks like. He held my hand when the entire council wanted to destroy him." Maya laughed and did something that still surprised Siravan, even after all these years. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around the tall silver alien in a full human embrace. The telepathic bond opened, and Siravan felt Maya's joy, her love for her new husband, her gratitude for this moment. And underneath it all, she felt the echo of Ethan's love for his daughter, a love that had rippled through generations and across stars. "That's from my dad," Maya whispered. "He said you'd understand." Siravan did understand. She understood everything. Later that evening, a journalist from the Valkyrian News Network interviewed Ethan about the events that had happened so many years ago. The interview would be broadcast across 100 worlds, watched by billions who wanted to understand the strange humans who touched so freely. "What were you thinking?" the journalist asked. In that moment when Siravan extended her hand in the council chamber, Ethan smiled the same warm smile he had given Siravan all those years ago. I thought she looked scared. He said simply, "And where I come from, when someone is scared, you hold their hand." The journalist tilted her head, her violet eyes filled with curiosity. "Even if it puts you at risk?" "Especially then," Ethan replied. "That's the whole point. You can't show someone they're not alone while keeping yourself safe. You have to reach out. You have to take the risk. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything." The interview was broadcast that night, and something changed across the Valkorian Empire. On a distant colony world, a father watched the broadcast with his young daughter beside him. When it ended, he looked at her small silver face filled with wonder, and he made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a few years before. He reached out and took her hand. The telepathic bond flared, and he felt her surprise, her confusion, and then her joy. Pure, overwhelming joy at being touched by her father for the first time in her life. "Why?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "Because I love you," he replied. "And because holding someone's hand is how humans show that they are not afraid." The little girl squeezed her father's hand and smiled. "Then I will not be afraid either," and across the stars, from Earth to the furthest reaches of the Valkorian Empire, a new age was beginning. An age where touch was no longer something to be feared, but something to be celebrated. Humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy was not their technology or their knowledge. It was something much simpler and much more powerful. It was the lesson that love means reaching out, even when you are afraid, and holding on tight until the fear fades away.